For a time in my mid to late 20s, I worked at a historical state park. I spent spring through fall in a variety of buildings filled with antiques, wearing clothes from the particular time period in which the location was set. I was your friendly local immigrant farmer, your 1830s military fort servant and also hospital worker, your 1870s typesetter and printmaster, and your 1760s Métis fur trader. You got a question about the price of pine marten fur or how to change out straw bedding in a hospital cot? You come to me first. Or if you've got a question about how to deal with Wisconsin humidity while wearing roughly minimum 3 layers of skirts, you are going to have to request session notes from my therapist. One building I never had the pleasure of working in, but happened to investigate paranormally multiple times, was Tonk Cottage. This building was set in the 1860s, and it was chock-a-block full of antiques, and it required the use of a hoop skirt for the female interpreter's costume, and let's just say, my hips don't lie. When I dip, you dip, we trip right over the irreplaceable 300-year-old mother-of-pearl inlaid cabinet. In the main parlor of the cottage, there was a glass dome resting on top of a circular wooden base that was resting on a marble side table. Inside the glass dome was intricately braided flowers that had beads spotted all over its surface. Shades of brown and golden leaves were woven in an upwards direction. I remember seeing it for the first time during an elementary school field trip, and then later on being able to get up close and personal with it. I finally learned what it was. It was thousands of strands of hair, all artistically twisted and knotted to make a beautiful and, I'll say it, eerie piece of work. From that moment on, it was my goal to let everyone and their mother know that the cheapest and easiest gift you could give someone is a wad of hair from your hairbrush for Christmas or for their birthday. Reduce, reuse, recycle at its finest, people. Learning the significance of the hair art left a distinct and endearing mark on my mind. It wasn't from a member of the family or a relative associated with the members of the historical home, but it was an artifact from the time period, and it would have been something that they might have had within their possession. When we did our spring cleaning at the park, Tonk Cottage was always my favorite and at the top of the list, and I requested to clean all of the weird stuff that we had in it. Yeah, it looks kind of strange from today's perspective because our hobbies don't really consist of hair wreath making, yet we still continue to carry on particular habits and traditions from way back then. Parents keep the first few clippings and baby curls from the first big kid haircut. Hell, I have a tooth fairy jar full of my dog's puppy teeth, and I'm not even sure I know where my own birth certificate is in my house. Hey there, I'm Megan, a freelance paranormal researcher and investigator of over 20 years, and welcome to Paranormal Potpourri, the show where we mix the ordinary with the extraordinary to uncover the strange, the mysterious, and the downright weird. The scent profile for today is chocolate bunnies and rhubarb. Let's take a deep breath and get into it. I've mentioned before that I am an overachiever at heart, so while working at the historical state park, I was also giving tours at a historical home down the road. Ironically, the family that lived in the historic house lived across the river from Tonk Cottage before it was moved to its current location. Hazelwood House was built in 1837 and was the epitome of frontier Victorian living. The Martin family, who still happened to occupy the house but in more ethereal forms, experienced their fair share of grief. Their oldest son, Stephen Leonard, was drafted into the Civil War, fighting in some of the deadliest and bloodiest battles like Antietam, Bull Run, and Fredericksburg. He also suffered from delusions of grandeur after the war, and he died within a county asylum in 1890. With the research I've done on this family, I've come to my own conclusion that my main man, Stephen Leonard, suffered from PTSD, but they didn't actually have the term for it quite yet. Next up was their eldest daughter, Annie. While in boarding school in New York with their second eldest daughter, Sarah, Annie contracted scarlet fever, which then morphed into rheumatic fever, and she passed away in 1862 at the age of 16. The family had another son between Annie and Sarah, and his name was Melanchthon. And the legend crafted by the tour docents at the house was that Melanchthon fell down the stairs and broke his leg and ended up dying from a blood infection. How he fell is a point of contention among the tour guides. Some would say he tripped as he was around 2 years old at the time. Some would say that Stephen Leonard pushed him down the stairs in a fit of jealousy. I know you're wondering, Melanchthon is a family name, and yes, we do need to bring it back into fashion. Again, huge nerd over here. And during my time there, I managed to do a decent amount of historical legwork on this family during my tenure in their home. And at the time of Melanchthon's death, the Martin family was hit hard by typhoid fever and diphtheria. And I'm pretty sure vaccines weren't invented yet for that sort of stuff. Most medical advice back then was just take an herbal infusion of cocaine and menthol and you'll be right as rain. Or not. Elizabeth Martin, the matriarch of this clan and one of my personal heroes, was a devout Quaker, which pretty much guarantees that she was most likely a die-hard spiritualist. To say Elizabeth was bereft over Annie's passing would be putting it lightly. She was devastated. Annie was staying with Elizabeth's sister at the time of her first illness, and her sister requested for Elizabeth to come out and come take care of her. Being the hashtag girl mom she was, Elizabeth told him it was time for 16-year-old Annie to learn how to pull herself back up by her bootstraps, and she always didn't need to call mom for these sort of things. By the time Elizabeth did go out to be with Annie after receiving news of her new diagnosis, it was close to the end and Elizabeth was beside herself with grief and guilt. Again, the family was plagued with illnesses, and Elizabeth has a journal entry where she writes that bringing the other children, there would have been two other children. I'm bad at math. 2 other children with them, and she called them a band of invalids as they traveled out to New York. So Elizabeth was so sure she would never, ever get over Annie's death that she needed some way to process the overwhelming grief and guilt she had over the entire situation. And she turned to her passion of writing as the only logical solution. Elizabeth was a prolific writer, keeping daily journals for years, which just gives me the hardest of historical boners because that documentation, though. And for 3 years after Annie's death, she kept a mourning journal. Inside the pages of the mourning journal, she detailed the attempts she made to make contact with her beloved departed Annie, who she called her soulmate. One entry of note had mention of Annie visiting her as an angel of bright light that hovered in the corner of her downstairs bedroom. Elizabeth's mourning journal is a fascinating first-person perspective of how grief was dealt with in a time when death was embraced, welcomed, and basically an expected part of everyday life. The Martin family was thrust squarely into the Victorian age customs and practices at a time when Wisconsin wasn't quite a state yet and was still considered the great wilderness of the West. Just imagine, herds of untamed cheese curds roamed the countryside. Culver's butter burgers howled at full moons. New Glarus spotted cow flowed freely in the streams. The concept of displaying your grief and mourning is not a modern one, although the culture around practices and funerary customs we're accustomed to came around with, who else? The Victorians. Queen Victoria really upped the ante on how one was to process grief both in the private and public sectors of their lives. After her husband Prince Albert passed in 1861, unfortunately no one got him out of the can, Queen Victoria would dedicate the next 40 years of her life to mourning his loss. Up until her death, it was totally natural to see her wearing just all black head to toe. Her public practices of mourning influenced every aspect of the culture of mourning and funeral practices. In 1840, the Workman's Guide published the appropriate length of time one could mourn a specific family member, along with the socially acceptable colors of mourning dress. It was expected that women took on a majority of the mourning practices, as men couldn't afford to, as they said, retire from society for the specified time due to business obligations. Women were more emotionally available to bear the burden, so to speak, and no one would look sideways at a woman crying with her friends. Hey, hold on, wait a minute. Who invited toxic masculinity to this party? Hey, get out of here. Get out of here. A death of a spouse was a minimum of 2 years of mourning. A loss of a parent would range between 6 months to a year. Children 10 years and older received 6 months to a year. Children 10 and under were mourned for 6 months. Infants were given at least 6 weeks. Grandparents and siblings, 6 months. Aunt and uncles, 2 months. Great aunts and uncles, 6 weeks. And first cousins, 4 weeks. There was no determined end for mourning. It was just more for how long you were supposed to externally show it. It was socially accepted that one could take all the time that they needed to mourn, that those around the bereaved respected the necessity of the process. The first year was called full mourning, and you were secluded from society, only attending church weekly for your quote-unquote outings. The second year was called half mourning, and you could begin to re-enter society. The mourning industry was one of the most lucrative in the time period, which would be equivalent to today's wedding industry. Clothes, dishes, stationery, accessories, decorations were all produced and available to help cater to those in mourning. How one dressed and the colors associated with the stage of grief you were in were strictly monitored. For the first year of mourning in the full or deep mourning, the color choices were limited. It was black. Everything was just black. I mean, we're talking, it's not a phase mom sort of black here. If you couldn't afford to buy new clothes, you would simply just have some older clothes that you had dyed black. The deep black clothing was trimmed with non-reflective fabric, so there were no silk or satin around here, folks. Everything was trimmed in black crepe, and you were adorned with minimal to no jewelry. And the way I can't say crepe without thinking of What We Do in the Shadows, one of the first episodes where Nando goes in and goes, crepe paper. I'm so sorry. Where were we? Widows were expected to wear silk or lace weeping veils or a widow's cap. Us ladies were held once again to incredible standards of fashion. Mourning clothes required full coverage to allow women to grieve in private without anyone being able to see them. So you've got full-length veils ranging between 6 to 8 feet long, were pinned and tucked up into hairstyles and into hats. The lace veils were soaked in arsenic, and many women experienced breathing problems or chemical burns and skin irritation while wearing them. I can't imagine why. Doctors finally spoke up about banning the practice of wearing veils only after a couple of women died from, strange, it says here, arsenic poisoning. And honestly, what's a few dead women when it comes to fashion? Am I right? So what did our counterparts, the men, have to wear? Wow. Black suits or a black armband or a black ribbon around their hats. I mean, how will they handle such drastic lifestyle changes? The second year of mourning was called half mourning, and the colors transitioned to gray and lavender colors with minimal decorative bits and baubles. Black as a color for mourning wasn't always a thing. White was the most common color for showcasing your grief. It probably also helped that it was the most affordable color choice for most people. Children would continue to wear white as a sign of innocence and purity as time went on. Wealthier mourners wore purple to stand out, making a fashionable stance of being able to afford such a luxury of this premium dyed clothing. I think showing a wealthy Victorian a picture of Barney would blow their mind straight out the back of their skulls. Oh, or even the Joker from the animated Batman series. Oh my God, can you imagine them seeing Prince in person? Black for mourning dates back all the way back to the Roman era, where a toga pulla made out of dark-colored wool was worn during the mourning period, and it becoming the en vogue choice came from Queen Victoria and her decades-long fashion change. Like I mentioned in the last episode, the Victorians embraced death as a part of their everyday existence. It wasn't hard to notice the vast economic differences that meant some had all and most went without. Not that sounds like anything in today's society. Not at all. Instead of saving money for a retirement plan, families saved for funeral expenses. How much was spent on a funeral showed the general public how much the deceased was loved and cared for. If families weren't able to afford a funeral, they could join a burial club, which helped them pay for the services. These clubs were founded on the idea that the working and lower class were afraid of not giving a proper send-off, so they would make weekly payments to cover burial expenses, regardless of how long they had been a member. Hello, group share insurance policies. For the wealthy in the community, this was the event of the year, a time to be seen and doing things as proper as possible. Local poor unions would offer to do bare minimum burials in the form of a pauper's funeral. This would include a pauper's grave, no headstone, and little to no pomp and circumstance around the funeral itself. The fear of a pauper's funeral was it being a sign of disrespect to the deceased, and it would show the community that your family had little to no funds for their send-off. But the bigger fear of a cheaper burial? Grave robbers. Bodies were prepped in such a way to prepare them for their eventual physical resurrection for Judgment Day, which meant no autopsies and no dissections. You needed all of your working parts to be resurrected. The Anatomy Act of 1832 legalized the dissection of those who died in prison, asylums, and workhouses. Families had 7 days to retrieve the body, and they had to be prepared to pay for a coffin and a churchyard burial upon arrival. If not, the body would be sent off to a local teaching institution. There was an incredible need for teaching bodies at universities, and the institutions that provided or donated bodies could turn a pretty penny profit on the uncollected. The medical field was starting to grow and explore, but not enough was known about how and why certain diseases, illnesses, injuries, diagnoses killed you. The simple act of being in a coma was a death sentence. Graveyards and funeral directors started putting in safeguards to prevent any accidental live burials. Some bodies were buried with a rope in their hand, which was attached to a bell on the surface. If they happened to wake up, they could ring the bell and be rescued. This tended to backfire spectacularly as bodies decomposed and the rope shifted, causing an eerie bell to toll months or years after burial. George Washington was so afraid of being buried alive that he requested that his burial be put off for a minimum of 5 days to allow for his body to begin to rot to definitively make sure he was dead. He also almost became our first zombie president, and I will never, ever forgive Martha Washington for her use of logic in that particular scenario. So this was one of my favorite stories to tell while working in the Fort Howard Hospital, which, shout out to Heritage Hill, is the oldest standing military hospital in the United States. Whoop whoop. And when I worked in the hospital as the matron, I would tell children and adults the story of George Washington turning into an almost zombie. When word spread of George Washington's death, with him being the first president, this kind of rocked the nation. This was not something they expected, even though it was, because he was kind of old. Martha got a couple of letters from doctors saying that they could revive him. One of the things being that he was cold, as a dead body usually should be cold. One wrote that to reverse that, to bring him back, we just warm him up. Warm towels, warm bed sheets. We heat the room up to surface level of the sun hot. And one of the other issues he was facing was he couldn't breathe. So they would, as my grandmother would say, stick a tube in him. And they would just pump air back into him, and they could bring him back to life, because no one was ready for the loss of the nation's president and war hero, George Washington. And as much as it pains me to admit, but Martha was kind of right in saying, no fucking thank you. I will bury my husband. And she did. They waited the amount of days that George wanted, about 5, until things started to leak. And he was buried in Mount Vernon. So there's that. If you want more information about weird things that happened to presidents before, a little bit before they died and a lot after they died, Dead Presidents by Brady Carlson is going to be where you want to look that up. It's a great read, and there's very disturbing information about Lyndon B. Johnson in that book too, about Little Johnson. I'm going to leave it at that. The funeral itself has adapted over the centuries, but some traditions have pretty much stayed the course from day one. The family of the deceased would hang a wreath of laurel and yew or boxwood tied with black crepe or ribbons on the front door to signal to the outside world that a death had occurred in the home. The preparation of the body for burial was done by a family friend. They would wash and dress the deceased in their normal clothing. Friends of the family also took over most of the social calls and duties, so the grieving family could be together and not worry about having to talk to others, figuring out their meals, or arranging the funeral. Funerals were an invite-only ordeal, with invites being sent out to those that the family wanted to see. These would be delivered by a private courier and were specifically designed to be recognized as a funeral invite, so there wouldn't be anyone trying to sneak into this event. Information was engraved on a small square piece of paper that had a wide black border. So my sincerest apologies, Rita, your ass ain't on the guest list. So take your dusty musty ass back home, and don't forget to take your dusty musty chicken cettuccine back with you too. Bye-bye. The service itself was held in the home of the bereaved. The body was placed in what would be considered a formal parlor, or in the front room of the home. If there were windows facing the street, sometimes the body would be placed in front of the big bay windows with the curtains open, so any passerbyers that weren't invited to the funeral service itself but wanted to pay final respects could walk by and see the body. The family would be set off to the side in a different room, protecting them from the collective show of grief of the invited guests. And I don't know how many funerals everyone listening has attended, but most funeral homes today have 2 rooms, or at least 2 areas set up for the service. You have the visitation room, where the body or the urn is located, and then you have kind of like a greeting area off to the side where you can share stories. The picture boards are there. Snacks are usually provided. We'll get to that. The coffin would remain open if the funeral was held at home, and closed if it was at church. In some areas of England and the rest of the world, there would be community involvement in the funeral, either at the home or at the church. Leavened bread would be placed on the deceased body to absorb any remaining sins, and individuals called sin eaters would come and consume the bread, essentially eating the sins and helping the deceased soul cross unburdened to the other side. Baked goods called funerary biscuits or cookies, if you're from America, were handed out at the service as mementos. These could also be placed on the chest of the deceased to soak up any leftover spiritual residue. Bakeries eventually started making and then distributing these cookies as time went on. They would be wrapped up all nice and neat in packages. Mourning poems and death notices could also be included in them as well. The funeral procession to the church or graveyard varied based on the cost of the total funeral service. A basic horse-drawn hearse was hired to transport the coffin. Glass viewing windows allowed a peek in at the deceased and the floral arrangements that were traveling with them. Black was the primary color for most hearses, but if it was a child, the hearse would be white, and the carriage itself would be smaller and then pulled by ponies. For an increasing fee, embellishments could be applied to the procession. If the deceased was a mounted military officer, there would be a horse accompanying the procession, fully caparisoned and draped in mourning, and if they were part of the Freemasons, living members, I would pay to see a zombie Freemason funeral procession. I'm sorry, that's awesome. But if they were part of the Freemasons, living members would walk in front of the hearse, leading the body to its final resting place. Families could add multiple black horses to help draw the hearse through the streets. You could add velvet coverings for both the coffin and horses, along with placing large ostrich plumes on each corner of the hearse, on the heads of horses, and on the attendants as well. The funeral and burial seemed like the end of celebrating the deceased's life and existence, except you may have forgotten who we're talking about here. The Victorians and their love of all things morbid. What better way to remember your dearly departed than with tchotchkes? The daily reminders of the possibility of an early departure from this life were aplenty. One such accessory was a frozen Charlotte doll. These were small, quite naked porcelain china dolls that were used to cool down hot liquids. A reusable ice cube with butt cheeks? It's the hottest new kitchen item that all good hostesses need. Somewhere out there, Martha Stewart is kicking herself in the ass for not thinking of that. So the lore around the frozen Charlotte doll was that it was named after a young girl named Charlotte, obviously, who froze to death after refusing to wear her cloak on a winter night out of fear of covering up the beautiful ball gown she was wearing. Hypothermia be damned, Mama. I'm showing off all my baubles to the trees and forest animals. The concept of memento mori, or remember that you have to die, permeated the Victorian culture to its bone marrow. And for any followers of Unis Annus back in the day, beware the gongoozler. I hope your peace honors are everything you wanted and more. Just remember the dance of Italy is still legal to perform, and make sure your scriddle is well seasoned. Tonk Cottage had a memento mori painting directly across from where the hair wreath was, which was a common piece of decor for the time period. It was a reminder to all that viewed it that death was inevitable. The motifs of a memento mori piece were generally skulls, accompanied by random smattering of bones. You could have coffins, hourglasses, wilting flowers were common artistic additives, a lot of bowls of fruit, open windows showing beautiful vistas, unfinished letters, half written, pens with ink dripping onto parchment. You know, things that say that this is what happened when time stopped. The hair wreath I was enamored with in Tonk Cottage was a part of a grander Victorian fancy work scheme that women of all classes could attend to on a daily basis. You could receive a magazine that had a variety of patterns and designs that you could use to create your own hairy masterpiece. Locks of hair were commonly taken from friends and family and then woven around thin pieces of wire, then shaped into flowers, sprigs, and leaves. If the color of hair you had didn't suit your needs, you could order the specific color you wanted. And now, the subplot of Joanna from Sweeney Todd is suddenly starting to make a lot more sense. A small sign or note was placed in the shadow box or display case to denote whose hairs and who was being memorialized at the time. Strands of the deceased's hair would be placed in the center, and as others died and joined the artwork, the other pieces would be moved gradually to the outside. Hair could be incorporated into mourning jewelry. The Victorian era was considered the golden age for this trend. Some of the most elaborate symbolic pieces of art were created during this time. The jewelry was used as a personal adornment, which was allowed by the strict guidelines of mourning fashion and worn to commemorate the deceased. Occasionally, symbols of death were included, like skulls, urns, or weeping willows. Hi, I'd like some of my Meepers bangs positioned squarely between these two skulls, flashing the rock-on hand signal, please and thank you. The emergence of public cemeteries gave the Victorians yet another place to show off the love you had for the deceased, along with flashing that pocketbook once again. Being buried in a pauper's grave meant no headstone, no place to really truly memorialize your final resting place. But a cemetery or a graveyard gave your loved ones that exact opportunity. I'm a jack of all trades, and when I was working at the Historical Society, I was also helping out at the cemetery walks they would put on during the summer. One of my favorite monuments is a giant obelisk that has to be a good, I'm bad at this, 18 to 20 feet tall, with a base that's at least 7 feet wide, all in honor of a local beer baron. I can only imagine how much it cost back in the 1800s to construct that, but in today's economic crisis, in today's economic upswing, it would break your bank, your mom's bank, your dad's bank, your grandma's bank, your grandma's crocheting friend's bank account. I can only imagine astronomical amount of zeros would be on that invoice. Headstones were the family's last way of sending a message to the future generations about who resides roughly 6 feet below. The symbols carved into headstones around the world are their own specific language. There isn't an expert out there that can rest their laurels, which might be a design, on knowing exactly what each of them mean or the combinations of them mean. Interpretation. It's all in your head, baby. Common images are crosses, doves, interlocked hands, angels, and roses, and abbreviations help denote accomplishments or achievements during their time on Earth. There is a cemetery in Oconto where my great-grandparents are buried, along with a few other distant relatives, that has one of the coolest headstones in it. It's, again, roughly 10 feet tall. It's shaped like a big, giant concrete log with raccoons coming out of it. And it's got holes and knots on the trees and all of that. And honestly, I take a picture every time I see it. I probably have good 20, 30 photos of this on my phone. Walking through cemeteries and looking at all the different artwork and styles has to be one of my favorite spring, summer, and fall pastimes. As fascinated with death as they were, the Victorians were still learning about it and the world around us, so there was a fair bit of trepidation to be had around the venture as a whole. Enter the realm of superstitions. After dying, the body would be watched by family and friends to make sure the spirit didn't leave the body unnoticed. Also helpful if you're trying to prevent premature burial of old peepums who just sleeps real hard during his naps. Bodies were carried out of a house feet first, so they couldn't look back and call someone else to come with them to the afterlife. All the curtains were closed, mirrors covered until after the funeral so that the deceased wouldn't get trapped in them. If you happened to see yourself in a mirror of a house of the recently deceased, it was believed that you'd be the next to die. All clocks were stopped, including watches, at the time of death to prevent bad luck. When passing a cemetery, people were told to hold their breath, otherwise they wouldn't be buried. Another version was unattached souls could get inhaled, and now you've got yourself in a bit of a pickle that now involves finding a young priest and an old priest. Also, never whistle in a cemetery because it will summon the devil. If you take flowers from a grave, that means the spirit will haunt you. A ring of flowers on a grave would help to keep a body firmly underground, preventing them from climbing up and out and wandering around aimlessly. So what I'm gathering here, looking context clues, is that the Victorians had bigger problems to deal with than previously thought. Zombies and possessions were big threats to their way of life, I'm guessing. If you've been invited to a funeral, never wear anything new, especially shoes. And if you happen to meet a funeral procession head on, you'll suffer bad luck if you are unable to turn around. So hold on to a button until it passes to prevent any lingering bad luck vibes. A distinctly European superstition is something called a phantom funeral. Those gifted with second sight could witness a funeral procession that wasn't occurring in the physical world. This would be a sign of imminent death for the community, as where the procession took place would be the eventual site of the upcoming funeral. Heading squarely to my Appalachian roots, death crowns were an omen of an impending final departure. These were mysteriously formed feather crowns found in the pillows of the soon-to-be or recently deceased. It's said that a person who has lived a pure and righteous life and is near death will have one of these in their pillow. And if it's found after death, it's a sign that the soul was accepted into heaven and their death was peaceful. Another sure sign that the deceased was well liked and respected in the community was by the amount of people who attended their funeral. I'd say the more the merrier, but I'm not sure if there's like a morose version of that, like the more the sadder, the more the morose. If you think your neighbor might be lacking in the whole respect department, you could hire professional mourners to attend the service and burial. The practice of a professional mourner, or for the more technical nerds out there, morologist, has been around for centuries. They've been found in Egyptian, Chinese, Mediterranean, Near Eastern, and Gaelic cultures. It's even mentioned in both the New and Old Testaments. You've got Book of Jeremiah, verse 9, 17 through 18. Consider now, call for the wailing women to come, send for the most skillful of them. Let them come quickly and wail over us till our eyes overflow with tears and water streams from our eyelids. And then you have Samuel 2:14. And fetched thence a wise woman, and said unto her, I pray thee, feign thyself to be a mourner, and put on now mourning apparel, and anoint not thyself with oil, but as a woman that had a long time mourned the dead. In ancient Greece, professional mourners would literally rip their own hair out in grief. These mourners would be followed by an archimime, which was a jester who imitated manners, gestures, speech, and even dressed like the deceased. This was seen as a sign of great success to have an actor hired to imitate you or your loved one. Recently, Ides of March, Julius Caesar had one. How he planned this all out, I don't know. Et tu, Brute? An archimime would walk behind the casket dressed in the deceased's clothes, and they would wear a mask of their likeness and waving at those gathered to watch the procession. God, that's kind of creepy to think about. This was a clever and maybe mildly disturbing way for the family to be protected and guarded from having to interact with others in public if the archetype of their loved one could do it instead. The professional mourner's job was to help the community as a whole face death together, name the tragedy that befell them, and help them express their grief. Sobbers, wailers, criers, and mutes were women who were often hired to lament the dead and express grief publicly, which would help the community begin to heal and move on from their loss. These were generally older women in the community that were given the task of finding the right words for when there were no words to be found. It was more appropriate and easier to allow women to express their emotions in a public setting rather than having to watch some random dude weep because, once again, toxic masculinity ruins the party. These women were considered sense makers, guiding people to begin to make sense of their feelings while everything else around them seemed to feel nonsensical. These women gave the go-ahead to the rest of the community and to those gathered at the gravesite that it was okay to openly grieve and express your sorrow. They were right there with you doing the same. If you've ever seen the brilliant film Midsommar with my boo Florence Pugh, there's a scene with a similar theme to wailing women, and it's both one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen and one of the most incredibly unnerving things to watch as it unfolds. There's a group of women, and they embrace Florence's character as she reacts to a particularly triggering event, and they scream and cry and wail along with her. She's quiet, they're quiet. She gets loud, they get loud. It is a cacophony of noise. My particularly triggering event was hitting a deer at 11 o'clock at night, going around 70 miles an hour, a day after watching Midsommar in theaters, and then explaining it at length at 3 a.m. in my kitchen because I was in shock and my mom knew I needed a distraction. It all made so much sense, but I don't suggest following my exact footsteps with that though. Wailing women offered two different ways of vocalizing grief: keening and lamenting. A lament is a poem, song, or piece of music which expresses sorrow over the fact that someone has died. It can be played at any time, anywhere, as a general moment of remembrance. For my fellow book talk girlies, Louise Gluck wrote a lament called The Triumph of Achilles, which is a retelling of some scenes from Homer's Iliad. Its main concern is the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus and what it means to be human in the face of suffering and death, as both men and friends, died in the Trojan War. The Triumph of Achilles by Louise Gluck. In the story of Patroclus, no one survives, not even Achilles, who was nearly a god. Patroclus resembled him. They wore the same armor. Always in these friendships, one serves the other, one is less than the other. The hierarchy is always apparent, though the legends cannot be trusted. Their source is the survivor, the one who has been abandoned. What were the Greek ships on fire compared to this loss? In his tent, Achilles grieved with his whole being, and the gods saw he was a man already dead, a victim of the part that loved, the part that was mortal. W.H. Auden wrote a modern-day version of a lament in his 1938 poem Funeral Blues, better known as Stop All the Clocks. Stop All the Clocks, Cut Off the Telephone by W.H. Auden. Stop all the clocks, cut off the telephone, prevent the dog from barking with a juicy bone, silence the pianos and with muffled drum, bring out the coffin, let the mourners come. Let aeroplanes circle moaning overhead, scribbling on the sky the message, he is dead. Put crepe bows round the white necks of the public doves. Let the traffic policemen wear black cotton gloves. He was my north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not wanted now. Put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood, for nothing now can ever come to any good. Probably the most recognizable lament is Danny Boy. The true meaning is still unclear, but the message stays the same. Danny Boy is saying goodbye most likely for forever. One theory suggests that the song is set during the Irish potato famine and that he's singing about the loss of his love or his mother. And another theory is that he is either immigrating or his love or family is leaving Ireland and he will never see them again. Danny Boy. Oh, Danny Boy, the pipes are calling. From glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the roses failing. It's you must go and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow, or when the valley's hushed and white with snow. It's I'll be here in the sunshine or in shadow, oh Danny Boy, I love you so. But when ye come and all the flowers are dying, if I am dead, as dead I well may be, you'll come and find the place where I am lying, and kneel and say an Ave there for me. And I shall hear, though soft you tread above me, and all my grave will warmer, sweeter be. For you will bend and tell me that you love me, and I shall sleep in peace until you come to me. To keen is a completely separate concept entirely. Keening is a vocal ritual art form that is performed at the wake or at the graveside. Keens are said to have contained raw, unearthly emotion, spontaneous words, repeated motifs, crying, and an element of song. Structure for keening revolved around banging on the coffin itself or stomping the feet on the ground. A keen is the final farewell to the deceased, composed and performed live, and the performers are often seen touching the coffin and addressing the corpse inside of it. The word itself comes from the Gaelic cuine, which means crying. In Irish and Scottish mythology, keening is often performed by banshees. A keening woman was called a banshee, which was quickly anglicized to banshee. A banshee is a female spirit who marked the impending death of a family member with a piercing scream, wail, or shriek. Some Irish families even had a banshee assigned to them. McCarthy's, McGraths, O'Neills, O'Reillys, O'Sullivans, O'Riordans, O'Flahertys, O'Connors, O'Briens, O'Grady's, and the Kavanaghs. If you've done family history and have any of those names in your bloodline, congrats! You've inherited yourself a banshee. And legend states that if a family emigrated, their banshees would follow them, and if she didn't, she would remain at the family seat in Ireland and lament their leaving. A less nightmare-inducing name for a banshee was the Woman of the Fairy Mound, and she would come and sing at the graveside, and her voice would be notably better than the singers the family may have already hired. That's fairies for you, folks. Better singers, eerily beautiful, impossibly fast, strong. Their skin is pale white and ice cold. Their eyes change colors, and sometimes they speak like they're from a different time. They never eat or drink anything. They don't go into the sunlight, and they've been 17 for a while. Oh my God. I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what came over me. That was just verbatim dialogue from the Twilight series, and I have to go back to rehab now. Goodbye. The overall appearance of a banshee generally stays the same across time and storytelling. She may have had long, streaming silver gray hair and could be seen combing through it. This inspired another superstition in Ireland around picking up a stray comb off the ground, as it would possibly get you nicked away to the land of fairies. I would like someone to explain to me how that sounds like a bad idea. A long gray cloak would be partially covering a green dress, and her bright red eyes were caused by her continuous crying. It's debated heavily if the banshee is a young woman or an old hag. Most stories refer to her as a ghost of a murdered woman or a woman who had died giving birth. She could also be a depiction of a keener, who were again the older women that were paid in alcohol for their services, and they often ended up as elderly alcoholics that were banished from all towns and villages. The maiden mother crone trifecta is a heavily used concept within Irish and Celtic mythology, and she may ultimately represent the Celtic goddess of war and death, Macha, or the Morrigan. The banshee may be accompanied or associated with the death coach. This would be a black coach driven by a dullahan, which is a headless rider that carries his own head on horseback. Or you've just been invited to Count Orlok's remote estate. Both of these were considered indicators or predictors of death. Seeing or hearing one of them didn't bode well for anyone in the vicinity. The banshee would occasionally take the form of a crow, stoat, hare, or weasel, which all belong to witchcraft in Irish folklore. Her cries and wails could be heard by all in nearby towns or by just a specific individual. Originally, the banshee would appear to those who were about to suffer a violent and awful death or be murdered. Her legend evolved to wailing outside the door of the soon-to-be expired at night or from the nearby woods, but rarely was she ever seen. And because every awesome party needs someone to poop at it, critics of the legend say that the cries people would hear from the woods are just barn owls or vixens, which are lady foxes, just hyping each other up in the woods. The actual sounds of her wails and cries are up for much debate depending on which area of Ireland you find yourself in. Leinster claims that her shrieks are so shrill that they can shatter glass. County Tyrone residents state that they sound like two boards being struck together. What are you guys up to over in old County Tyrone that's an understandable reference for you guys to make? And over in County Kerry describes it as a low, pleasant singing sound that can be heard from great distances. Banshee chairs can be found in the idyllic Irish countryside. These stone outcroppings are where banshees are witnessed sitting and crying for general misfortunes if there are no upcoming deaths to signal. The Scots had their version of the banshee called the Banine, or washing woman. No wailing or crying came from her. She could be seen washing in a local water source the bloodied clothes of the person about to perish. That's an ominous sort of creature I can get behind, one that tidies the damn place up every now and again. My time working at Hazelwood House and at the Historical State Park gave me a better understanding of the concept of death and the afterlife. I was lucky enough to read a few passages from Elizabeth Martin's Morning Journal, and they were still so poignant and full of heartache 160 years after the fact. I happened to kick off my paranormal investigator lifestyle change at Hazelwood House, interacting with the Martin family members that still called Hazelwood home, and the buildings at the historical park were teeming with the afterlife. The one program my friend and I tried to resurrect was recreating a historically accurate 1860s funeral at Hazelwood, and we just couldn't get the time or help we needed to complete it, but I think it would have been the coolest and greatest accomplishment of my historical career. The act of a funeral, even in today's society, is a solemn affair, and one that really hasn't changed or felt the need to change from its set ways. Sure, there are new ways of embalming or alternative burial choices, but the final viewing, eulogy, sharing of memories still remains. Unless you're my aunt's pet hamster from when she was younger and your final resting place was in one of those plastic eggs that Le Egg hosiery came in during the 1970s. I also want it on record that I am okay with eventually being Grandma Celine. AKA put me in a casket on the iced over river and then wait a couple of months for warmer weather and for the ice to go out, and then that sends my dead ass down the river to the funeral home. I can't say for certain if that actually happened or not, but it's a part of family legend, and I am all for dusting off those and bringing back them to more modern times. I spend a lot of my time dealing with the after effects of death, and it's an oddly comforting aspect I wasn't expecting when starting down this path. You hear a lot of times, I hope they're finally somewhere nice, or I just know they're at peace now, and I can verify pretty easily, not only as a paranormal investigator, but as a psychic medium as well. The fear I once had of death and the sheer finality of it has greatly dissipated the more and more I venture into this world, and the more and more I work on my own curious set of skills. I've already informed several people in my life of the extreme potential of my haunting of them in the future, and they need to begin the mental preparation needed to deal with my poltergeist of an ass. The title of this episode comes from a childhood classic, Alvin Schwartz's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, the Hearse song. There'll definitely be an upcoming episode about the trauma those books cause most of us millennials around bedtime. Don't you ever laugh as the hearse goes by, for you may be the next to die. They wrap you up in a big white sheet from your head down to your feet. They put you in a big black box and cover you up with dirt and rocks. All goes well for about a week. Then your coffin begins to leak. The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. The worms play pinochle on your snout. They eat your eyes, they eat your nose, they eat the jelly between your toes. A big green worm with rolling eyes crawls in your stomach and out your eyes. Your stomach turns a slimy green and pus pours out like whipping cream. You spread it on a slice of bread, and that's what you eat when you're dead. Thanks again for sticking around for this episode and for the wait. Life just kind of snowballed, quite literally. It was 60 degrees on Monday, and then we had a snowstorm on Wednesday that dumped about 3 inches of snow. So that was fun on the old seasonal depression. But thanks for sticking around and listening to this episode. You can find more at www.alreadyhereinvestigates.com. If you are a fan of the old Facebook, you can find me at Already Here Investigates. That is going to be my paranormal research investigating page, and at the Paranormal Potpourri group. There's also another one called the Already Here Investigates The Collective, where you can post memes and silly stuff and see more of my rambles there. The Potographs Parafest 6, that was a couple of weekends ago, was an ultimate success. We were able to raise $7,100 for the Roscommon Animal Shelter, and next year it's going to be even bigger and better. We got Tim to sing karaoke, so that was kind of awesome. I did get to meet Dustin Perry and Shane Pittman, and still riding that high. That was kind of nice. Other than that, thank you to Audacity, and thank you to the artists on Pixabay for the use of my intro, outro, and segue music. Again, my name is Megan. This is Paranormal Potpourri, and we'll smell you later.